Our presentation tonight is, of course, Dragonflies and Damselflies. Colin Jones is the Provincial Arthropod Zoologist at the Natural Heritage Information Center with Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry in Peterborough. He deals primarily with rare species. So what are arthropods? They are a category of invertebrate animals that includes insects, arachnids, myriapods, and crustaceans, if you didn't know. Over the past 29 years, Colin has been studying Odonata, which is dragonflies and damselflies. He is coordinator of the Ontario Odonata Atlas Project, and he's also the co-author of 2 publications, a field guide to the dragonflies and damselflies of Algonquin Provincial Park and surrounding area, now in its 2nd edition, and the ROM field guide to the butterflies of Ontario. In March of last year, Colin was actually booked to do this very presentation in person as part of the Hastings Stewardship Council Winter Speaker Series 2020. They were very disappointed to have to cancel the event due to COVID. And so we were all delighted to be able to invite Colin to our online Winter Speaker Series. And I couldn't help but notice, Colin, that actually you have had a whole year to prepare. So we are expecting terrifically big things of you tonight. And with that, I shall pass it over to Colin Jones.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much, Susan. And thanks for inviting me. And I'm very happy to be here virtually with all of you. Looks like a great turnout, which is excellent. And I see that there's people even from the West Coast who have dialed in. So it's this is one of the nice things about having virtual meetings is people from anywhere can join in. You don't have to just be a local person. So as Susan mentioned, I'm the Provincial Arthropod Zoologist with the Natural Heritage Information Center, which is part of the Science and Research branch of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. I'm based out of Peterborough. And again, like Susan had mentioned already, I've been studying dragonflies and damselflies since the early 1990s, long before I started working for the Natural Heritage Information Center. And I have the great privilege to continue to work on these incredible insects in my capacity at the NHIC, which is the acronym for Natural Heritage Information Center. And I also work on a whole deal of other insects, focusing on the rare species that are found within the province. Our center focuses on rare species. We do our own field work, but we also collect and collate data on the occurrences of rare species in the province. These go into a large database, and that database is used for a variety of land use and conservation planning initiatives. But tonight we're going to focus in on the dragonflies and damselflies of Ontario. And I will start off with a brief introduction on what these insects are. We will then move into the bulk of the presentation, which will be about their fascinating life history. For those of you who've watched dragonflies and damselflies and maybe even studied them yourselves, you know they have a very fascinating life history. And so the vast majority of this presentation will be focused in on their life history. Here's a mating pair of American Emerald dragonflies, and we'll get into more of the details of that a little later. I'm going to also touch on how you yourselves can go out and learn more and appreciate dragonflies and damselflies, some of the tricks and techniques to learn more about them yourselves, as well as a number of citizen science initiatives that you can get involved in if you do start focusing in on these creatures and want to contribute to the collective effort of learning more about their distribution and their ecology. And then I'm also going to talk about the various habitats that they're found in here in Ontario, as well as some of the conservation initiatives that are taking place to protect especially the rarest of the species that we have here. So let's get into the beginning of the presentation, which is what these creatures are. They are, of course, insects, and they're in the order of insects called the Odonata. And within that order of insects, there are two suborders, the damselflies, and this is an example of a damselfly, the Ebony Jewelwing. This is the suborder Zygoptera. And you can tell damselflies apart from dragonflies because damselflies tend to be smaller. They tend to be much more, they're thinner bodied. And the main thing that distinguishes them is the fact that when they're at rest, their wings are held over their backs, folded over their backs, as you can see here. There are always exceptions in nature, of course, and there's one family of damselflies where this is an exception. These are the spread-wing damselflies, and you can see here in this individual that the wings are actually held out at about 45-degree angle to their body. This is an emerald spread wing, and this is the one exception to the damselfly rule. But unlike dragonflies, their wings are not held out perpendicular to their body. So here is a dragonfly. This is a black saddlebags, called saddlebags because they have these markings here on the wings that kind of look like saddlebags on a bicycle. Dragonflies tend to be larger. They're more robust, thicker through the body. And when they're at rest, their wings are always held out perpendicular to their body like an airplane. So these are the main differences between dragonflies and damselflies. Dragonflies are in the suborder Anisoptera. Water is very important to dragonflies and damselflies because the vast majority of their life is actually spent underneath the water in the larval or nymphal stage. And it's only a brief portion of their life, typically only a few weeks, where they're in the adult stage. In the larval stage, under the water, they can be there for up to 4 or 5 years, depending on the species. Here is a larval damselfly. This is the Ebony Jewelwing, the one we just saw moments ago with the jet black wings. And again, dragonflies and damselflies have differences in the larval stage that separate them. Damselflies tend to be, again, longer and skinnier, but they have these 3 caudal appendages off the tip of their abdomen, which differs from dragonflies, which you'll see in a moment. And these caudal appendages are actually the way they breathe under the water. So they're able to, the surface area is quite large of these, and they're able to take oxygen out of the water, and this enables them to breathe. Dragonfly larvae, on the other hand, lack these caudal appendages. Here at the tip of the abdomen, you can see they don't have them. They're typically thicker and more robust. So how, you might ask, do they breathe underwater? Well, they actually have internal gills. And so they suck water in through their rear end and extract the water using their internal gills, and then they pump the water back out again through their rear end. So it's very much like breathing air for us humans, where we draw air into our lungs, extract the oxygen, and breathe it back out again. The only difference here is that they're doing it through their rear end. This gives them an added advantage because one of the things they can do is they can very rapidly shoot the water back out of their rear end to propel themselves forward with jet propulsion. And this enables them to get away from any aquatic predators that might be trying to catch them for a meal, such as fish. This is a diagram of a dragonfly larva. This is the head. Here are the eyes, the front pair of legs. And what you see here is their lower lip. In the larval stage, they have this extendable lower lip, which is very much like an arm. There's joints here and joints under their head. And when at rest, this is collapsed underneath their head. And they're very much ambush predators. These are predatory insects that eat other creatures. And they often sit in the muck or mud or in the vegetation. And when a predator comes nearby, this lower lip shoots out with lightning speed, and these very sharp pincers at the tip grab onto the prey, and then they pull that prey towards their actual chewing mouth parts, which are underneath their head here, and then they're able to consume their prey that way. So they're very voracious predators. It's a very good thing that we're not tiny little creatures, because swimming would be pretty scary with these predators in the water. What do they feed on? Well, when they're very small, they feed on microscopic or near microscopic organisms, such as these Daphnia or water fleas. And as they grow larger, they begin to feed on larger and larger prey, eventually feeding on larger insects, such as this back swimmer, and even small fish, tadpoles, and salamander larvae. This is the larva of a spotted salamander. Once they finish their larval stage, they crawl out of the water. And again, this is anywhere from a few months, depending on the species, to several years. And at this point, something remarkable happens. They usually crawl out onto the bank of the stream or a rock or a log. And the back here begins to split open so that the adult can emerge. I have a fascinating video clip here that I'm going to share with everyone. This actually was taken by, this footage was taken by Doug Collicott in Manitoba, and it captures the emergence of one of our darner species called the variable darner. And he's used time-lapse photography, video photography, to capture this process, which normally takes about an hour, and we certainly don't have an hour to watch this tonight, but it speeds it up to just a much shorter time. And I'll walk you through what's happening here. It's really a fascinating video. So here is the darner. The head is at the top of the screen. You can see the wing buds, which are sort of moving around. This is because it's pumping its hemolymph through its body, which is helping to split open the middle of the body there just behind the head. And as it's pumping here, you're going to start to see that expanding, and eventually you're going to see it starting to crack open. There's the head capsule beginning to crack open, and here comes the adult emerging now. So you can see the thorax, the middle part of the body, is starting to come out. You can see the wing buds. The wings are starting to come out of the wing buds. Right now, they're all shriveled up. There comes the head. You can start to see the legs there coming out, and it starts to sort of use gravity to help itself get the last part of its body now, the abdomen, the third segment of its body coming out, and it's waiting and waiting and waiting. At this point, it flips up and it actually grabs back onto its exoskeleton, and out comes the abdomen. And so you can see now very much looks like an adult dragonfly, except the wings are still all shriveled up. So now it begins to pump that hemolymph, which is the equivalent of insect blood, through the veins in the wings, and it inflates them kind of like a party balloon. And you can see those wings are expanding and expanding. At the same time, the abdomen is starting to expand a little more as well, as the hemolymph pumps through the body. In just a moment here, this says next morning. This is what happened in the lab for Doug, but normally this takes about an hour, at which point the adult dragonfly flies away. And so this is a remarkable transformation. We all marvel at transformation between a caterpillar and a butterfly or moth. But that transformation takes place in the pupal stage, and it usually takes place over a week or more, or even several months, where the caterpillar changes to the adult. This process of this aquatic creature to this flying insect takes just about an hour. So it's a really also incredibly remarkable transformation. What's left behind is this exoskeleton, which we call the exuviae. And many of you have probably seen these. If you have a waterfront property, you maybe seen them on your dock. You can see them on logs or rocks along the streams. These can actually be identified to the species level, and is actually a very important way for anyone wanting to do an inventory of the dragonflies and damselflies they might have in their stream or pond or lake, because some species are very, very difficult to detect in the adult stage. Some are canopy feeders, and they're very seldom come down to the water except to breed. And so adding surveys of the exuviae that you might find in any given water body is an important way to find out what species are found in any given area, because like I said, some of the adults are very, very difficult to find. Once the adult has emerged, it actually wanders off away from the water body for several days while its exoskeleton hardens up, its sexual organs mature, and only after that point does it begin to feed actively. And just like the larval stage, these are voracious predators, but they're very visual hunters. And when you look at a dragonfly, one of the things you really notice is that almost their entire head is made up of eyes. And so there are two big compound eyes on either side. These are made up of thousands of individual facets. And this enables them to see almost in 360 degrees. They're very, very visual creatures. Their antennae are very reduced. Unlike many insects where the antennae are used for sensory purposes, for smelling or feeling, touching, tactile, they don't really use their antennae for very much. They might help a little bit in flight navigation, but they're very visual creatures. Their wings are extremely powerful, and they all operate independently of one another. And this enables them to be incredibly acrobatic flyers. And of course, everyone who's watched dragonflies know that they can fly very quickly back and forth. They can hover in one spot, and they can even fly backwards to a certain degree. Their legs are all sort of forward facing, and they're very spiny. And this basically creates a basket. And so as they're flying through the air, looking for insects, this basket creation of their legs enables them to capture very effectively and hold on to any prey items that they might find. Once they've caught their prey, oops, sorry, I've lost my cursor here for just a second, trying to advance there we go. Once they've caught their prey, they no longer have that lower lip that extends like the larval stage does, but they have very, very strong mandibles here in their mouth parts that enable them to crunch through even the hardest insect prey like beetles. What do they feed on primarily? In the adult stage, they're mostly feeding on flies. This is a fly. It looks like a wasp. This is actually a thick-headed fly in the family Canopidae. They feed very extensively on a whole variety of different kinds of flies, including some of the biting insects that we all find incredibly annoying, like black flies and mosquitoes and horseflies and deer flies. Here's an eastern pondhawk female feeding on a big horsefly. But they'll feed on any kind of insect that they can catch. And some will even feed on large insects like butterflies. There's one dragonfly called the black-shouldered spiny leg, which seems to be a little bit of a butterfly specialist. We hold a dragonfly and damselfly count every year in Algonquin Park. And every year, while I'm up there doing this count, without fail, I typically find a black-shouldered spiny leg either hunting or one that has caught a butterfly, usually a fritillary like this great spangled fritillary. They'll even hunt their own kind. Here's a fascinating photograph. Most of the photographs in this presentation are my own, but I do have a few from others. This fascinating photograph was taken by Michelle Porter, and it shows a lancet clubtail here that has actually managed to catch and is feeding on, it's biting into the side of the body here, of a stream cruiser, a dragonfly that's actually larger than itself. So this is just a good illustration of how voracious these insects can be as predators. They have their own predators, of course, as well, including birds. Here's another photograph not taken by myself, but by a photographer in this local Peterborough area, Stuart Stick, where he's captured really nicely this common grackle, which has a mouthful of freshly emerged dragonflies. Many of you have probably noticed during the month of June, primarily, red-winged blackbirds, common grackles, walking along the shoreline and picking things up. What they're picking up are emerging insects, many of which are dragonflies and damselflies. And they're picking these up to go back to feed the young in the nest. Spiders will also catch dragonflies and damselflies in their webs. Here's an orb weaver with an American emerald in its web. That's going to help to feed it for many days, I'm sure. And then, in sort of an ironic twist of fate, although in the larval stage, dragonflies and damselflies will sometimes feed on tadpoles, in the adult stage, the tides turn. And often, especially freshly emerged dragonflies and damselflies, once they crawl out of that, out of the water, go through that 1 hour process of emerging into an adult, and they take that first little voyage flight to try to get into the safety of the vegetation. You might get a green frog like this one here, or a bullfrog gobbling them down. And even plants. Those of you who spent time in our fens and bogs of Ontario will know this plant. This is one of the Sundew plants. And these plants have a sweet, sticky secretion that they secrete out of their leaves. And that attracts insects, primarily flies that want to come in and feed on this. And although dragonflies and damselflies are not interested in feeding on this themselves, once in a while they'll haphazardly land on this plant just as a perch, get stuck, and then the enzymes that are secreted by the plant digest the insect, and the plant feeds on the insect. Once the adults, sorry if you're hearing my dog barking, someone's at the front door. Hopefully he'll stop soon. My wife's dealing with that. Once they emerge as an adult and they begin feeding, what they're really interested in doing is mating. This is the primary role of insects, of adult insects of any kind, is to find a mate so that they can breed, lay eggs, and start the life cycle over again. And the breeding life history of dragonflies and damselflies is one of the most fascinating of all insects. They have a very complex breeding pattern, and I'll go through that process right now. This is a pair, by the way, of beautiful damselflies called rainbow bluettes. Rainbow bluettes because the males especially have all sorts of beautiful colors: orange, blue, yellow, green, very, very colorful individuals. The first thing that happens during the process of mating is that a male, this is a ringed dancer, and the male takes the tip of the abdomen here, where the primary genitalia are in most insects, and it actually curves the abdomen around and transfers the sperm, which is produced here in the primary genitalia, from there to the base of the abdomen here, where there is a set of secondary genitalia. So this is the first thing that this group of insects has to do before mating. And you'll see why in a little while they have to do this, transferring the sperm from the tip to the base. This is unlike most other insects. And at the base of the abdomen, there's a whole toolkit here of various things. These are called hamules. You can see it almost looks like a bit of a Swiss Army knife thing going on here. There's a bunch of different tools in there. And again, we'll figure out why they have that shortly. So once the male's transferred the sperm from the tip of the abdomen to the base of the abdomen, he then goes off and looks for a female. And when he finds a prospective female, he flies out and attempts to grab her either behind the head for most dragonflies, or at the first part of the middle part of the body, called the prothorax, which is just behind the head. So he'll attempt to grab her, and he grabs her with special appendages at the tip of his abdomen. Here's a pair of appendages here of a lance-tipped darner. You can see why it's called lance-tipped, because it's got this very sharp point here. And the male will grab the female with these appendages. And different dragonflies and damselflies of different species have different shaped appendages. Here's a bunch of the bluettes. These are the small little, typically black and blue damselflies that you often see around ponds and lakes. And you can see that each species has a different shape of these claspers at the tip of their abdomen. This is important because when the male is looking for a female, he's grabbing her, in the case of the damselflies, just behind the head on this prothorax. And there are these mesostigmal plates. And those plates are designed in such a way to receive the specific shaped appendages of the species that, the same species. So a male will not be able to grab very effectively the female of another species. It sort of acts like a lock and key mechanism. This is one of the ways that they prevent from hybridizing with and breeding with the wrong species and creating hybrids. Hybrids can exist in some species, but this is a way that most time it is prevented. Those appendages have to fit into the prothorax of the female. And here are those mesostigmal plates of the female, and you can see again, they're all different shapes to correspond with the male of the same species. So once the male has grabbed onto the female and everything seems right, thinks he's got the right species, at this point in time, it's up to the female to decide whether or not she wants to mate with that particular male. Because in order to receive the sperm, she has to curve her abdomen around and join the tip of her abdomen to the base of his abdomen in order to receive the sperm. But this is up to her to decide. And if she doesn't like that particular male for whatever reason, she will refuse to do this. And eventually that male will give up and usually let her go and look for another female. But if she does choose to mate with him, she receives the sperm package, and that helps to fertilize her eggs. So now at this point, you can see why the male has to transfer the sperm from the tip of his abdomen here to the base of his abdomen here, because this already is a pretty incredible act of contortionism. Can you imagine what she would have to do if she had to somehow get her abdomen over her head, over to this part of his abdomen to get the sperm? It'd be almost impossible. So this precisely is why they have these secondary genitalia and they have this system of mating, which, like I said earlier, is quite unique to insects. And this is often called the wheel position, but more appropriately should be called the heart position, because you can see that it forms this heart shape, and of course, they're in love. So once the female is mated with the male and has received the sperm package, she then will go off to lay her eggs. All the damselflies and one group of the dragonflies called the darners, these are typically the large dragonflies you see mostly at the end of the summer, mid to late summer. This group of dragonflies and all the damselflies actually have an ovipositor, so a sharp dagger-like process, and they actually inject their eggs into plant tissues, either living tissues like this darner here, or into dead wood or other plant material. And this is just an example of what that ovipositor looks like. You can see the sharp process here, and that is what is used to inject the eggs into the plant tissue. All of the other dragonflies, including this eastern pond hawk, which we saw earlier feeding on that horsefly, all of the other dragonflies lack this ovipositor, and rather they have a process under the 9th segment of their abdomen called the vulval laminae, or the genital plate, and the eggs basically come out from here, often forming a ball. So this was a species called the Rapids clubtail, which is one of our endangered species here in Ontario. This is a female, and you can see this ball of eggs here accumulating on the tip of her abdomen. Shortly after I took this photograph, she flew out over the river, and she started to dip the tip of her abdomen in the water, which helped to wash the eggs off into the stream, where they then settled down into the gravel and the sediment of the stream, where they would then later hatch into the larval stage. Many dragonflies and damselflies the females will lay their eggs on their own. In some species, the males will guard the female while she's laying her eggs. So they'll stay nearby and they'll ward off any other males that might be around trying to mate with her. And in some of the damselflies, they'll take it even one step further. These are blue-tipped dancers. Two males here at the top, you can see they're still actively holding on to the females, while the females are here putting their abdomens actually under the water and injecting their eggs into this pondweed here. And so these males are guarding their females completely without not even letting them go. And so why do this? Well, the reason why goes back to these hamules here at the base of the abdomen. So if a male comes along and grabs onto a female, one of the first things he does is use one of the tools in that little toolkit of his hamules to scoop out any sperm package that might be there from a previous mating, so that he can then replace that with his own sperm package to ensure that it's his genetic material that's going into the offspring. And so some damselflies never even let the females go until they've laid their eggs. And so this makes it impossible for any male to come along and grab the female. So why don't all species do this? Well, there are risks to this. These two males here are extremely vulnerable right now as this is happening, as is illustrated quite well in this particular photograph here of another species called the double-striped bluet. Here's the female here, there's the male, but if you follow the male's abdomen up, you'll see that something's missing. The rest of the male. There's no thorax, there's no head left. So while this male was guarding the female, something came along and made a meal out of the rest of him. So there are risks to this particular strategy, which is why some species have evolved to only fly around and guard their females, and others have just decided to leave the females completely to their own processes while she's laying her eggs. So regardless of the mating strategy and the breeding strategy, the eggs hatch into the larval stage, which I said earlier can last for anywhere from a few months up to several years, and the whole process starts over again. So that in a nutshell is the life history of dragonflies and damselflies. There's a lot more I could tell you about it, but we don't have a huge amount of time. But it's a really fascinating life history, and anyone who's watched them, you've probably witnessed some of these parts of their mating behavior. What I want to move on to now is a little more about how you can learn more about these creatures yourself. This is my daughter when she was quite a bit younger, holding one of those nice big darners one day when we were out catching dragonflies and having a close look at them. And in order to do that, of course, you want a net. You can identify a lot of dragonflies and damselflies with binoculars because they're distinctive enough, but some species you really do need to catch them and have a closer look at them in order to identify them to species. And so an insect net is helpful for that. And again, this is my daughter and my son when they were younger, chasing after some prince basket tails at a cottage we were at one summer. In order to identify what you're seeing, you want to pick up some sort of field guide. This is one of the earliest field guides that came out to dragonflies and damselflies. In this case, it was specific to the damselflies. And this is Damselflies of the Northeast, written and illustrated by an incredibly talented artist, Ed Lamb from New York. And this is by far, to this day, still one of the best field guides, in my opinion, that's ever been produced anywhere in the world. A really, really excellent resource, beautifully illustrated, and will help you identify the damselflies that you're finding. And it's comprehensive for Ontario as well. This is northeastern United States, as well as eastern Canada. I was very privileged to work with some good friends who I spent my formative years in Algonquin Park as an Algonquin Park naturalist with. We, like I said, in the early 90s, got very interested in this group. There were really no field guides available at the time, so we started to work towards a field guide of our own. And so together with Matt Holder, who helped with the text, he and I worked on the text, and two very talented artists, Peter Burke and Andrea Kingsley, did the illustrations. It took us 10 years to put this together, but the first edition came out in 2008. Second edition came out in 2013, and the second edition is still available. It covers all of the dragonflies and damselflies found in Algonquin Park, as well as the surrounding area, which is a large area, from Georgian Bay across to the Ottawa Valley, south to the southern edge of the Canadian Shield, and north to North Bay, Sudbury area. So for those of you who are in the Salmon Napanee River area, this is mostly comprehensive. There's a few species that will be missing, but it's mostly comprehensive for your area as well. This is just an example of what typically it looks like on the inside. So 1 or 2 species per page. This is the mustache clubtail, text on description, similar species that you might confuse it with, a little phenogram here of when you could expect to see it flying as an adult, habitat, flight period, status and range, and then illustrations of both males, females, lateral view, dorsal view, as well as illustrations of these appendages, which we talked about earlier, and the female genital plates. And there's just another example of damselflies. In this case, we've got 2 different species on a single page. This is produced by the Friends of Algonquin Park and is available through the Friends of Algonquin Park, either online or by visiting the bookstores in Algonquin Park in the Visitor Center on Highway 60. And then once you start learning a little more about these creatures and identifying what you're finding, it's very much like birds and bird watching. The more habitats you visit, the greater diversity of species you're going to encounter. So by visiting slow, sluggish streams like this one, you might encounter species like this violet dancer, this beautiful purple damselfly. Or if you're down in extreme southwestern Ontario, you might be fortunate enough to see one of our rare species. This is a spectacular species called the flag-tailed spiny leg. One of my favorite dragonflies that we have here in Ontario. It's got this huge, big club at the tip of the abdomen and some really spectacular colors. Other kinds of rivers, like fast-flowing streams that you'd find primarily on the Canadian Shield, will harbor other species, like this swift river cruiser, one of the largest dragonflies we have, and a really spectacular dragonfly with these emerald green eyes and these yellow markings on the abdomen and thorax. And then small, clean streams, shallower streams with rocks emerging like this are typical haunts for another kind of dragonfly called the eastern least clubtail, another beautiful little dragonfly. Our lakes harbor a different suite of species, including our largest dragonfly in the province, the dragon hunter. This is an illustration from the field guide, which I mentioned earlier for Algonquin Park. And this is an aptly named species because they primarily hunt other dragonflies for prey, thus the dragon hunter. And then ponds like this one here has a whole suite of different species yet again. The unicorn clubtail, this blue dasher, and the slaty skimmer are all pond species. And then by visiting peatlands like fens and bogs, you'll encounter yet another suite of species that you won't find in these other habitats. And some of our rare and uncommon species are found in these habitats, such as this one here, the Ebony Bog Haunter, one of my favorite names for a dragonfly. Great name, great creative name. You'll find that many dragonflies and damselflies have creative names like that. And this is the elfin skimmer. This is North America's smallest dragonfly. It's smaller than most damselflies. This is a minuscule, tiny little dragonfly. This is a female, which is yellow and black. She's so small, and because of her black and yellow coloration, when you first see one, you might mistake it for one of the hoverflies or even like a bee or a wasp, but fascinating little creatures. And then if you're fortunate enough to get up into the far northern parts of Ontario, into the Hudson Bay lowland, to the great extents of peatlands found there, muskeg, taiga, you'll find yet another group of species that you don't find further south, very northern species, including many emeralds, such as this ringed emerald that you see here. Once you start exploring habitats and learning more about dragonflies and damselflies, you may want to start contributing your records to our collective knowledge, our ever-growing collective knowledge of their distribution and even their biology and ecology. And there's several ways you can go about doing that. One of the online portals for submitting your records is Odonata Central. The website is down at the bottom of the screen there. And this is just a screen capture of a typical map generated from the records that people have submitted. This particular map shows in the US their distribution by counties of the beaver pond clubtail. And in Canada, rather than using counties, it uses these sort of lat long blocks. As you zoom into this map, and by toggling some settings over on the side here, you can actually see more precise pinpoint records. But this is one way that you can contribute your records to a collective knowledge, is through Odonata Central. And then another and more sort of recent online portal that's growing much more interest, ever rapidly growing interest, I should say, and many of you perhaps are using this yourself, is Inaturalist. Again, the website's down the bottom of the screen here. There's a Canadian portal, inaturalist.ca, but there's also inaturalist.org, which is sort of more comprehensive and worldwide. And this again is just a screen capture of the records for a different species, the swift river cruiser. And in this particular species, you can see that to date, over 1,200 observations have been submitted to Inaturalist of this species. by 481 different observers. Inaturalist also has the advantage of allowing people to create projects. And the center that I work at, the Natural Heritage Information Center, the NHIC, we've created a project that people can join that enables us to gather and collate observations of provincially rare species in the province. So if you join our project, you don't have to know what species are rare or not. It will automatically enter any records that you have entered yourself, provincially rare species, into our project. And as you can see, I took this screen capture earlier today. We are now up to almost 70,000 observations of provincially rare species of nearly 2,000 species from 850 people who have joined our project. This has become an incredibly useful tool for us in our center to gather and collate rare species observations from a whole variety of people, including professional biologists, but also casual naturalists and other citizen scientists. It's really become an incredibly important tool for us to do the work that we do at discovering where rare species are, so that they can be considered for a variety of conservation and land use planning initiatives. Speaking of conservation and protection of species, there are two bodies, one provincial and one national, that go through an assessment process. So looking at not just insects, but birds and vascular plants and bryophytes and fishes and other vertebrates. The provincial level, the Committee on the Species, the Committee on the Status of Species at Risk in Ontario, CSIRO, and at the federal level, CSIWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. These two bodies assess through a formal process the at-risk status for species and designate them after the process either endangered, threatened, special concern, not at risk, or data deficient. Or for those unfortunate species that we no longer think are found, we classify those as extirpated. And so when these bodies assess species, they are then eventually, in most cases, added to the endangered species list for the province or the country. The first dragonfly in Ontario that was ever assessed is the Rapids clubtail. I mentioned the species earlier. That was the one that had where the female had the ball of eggs on the tip of her abdomen. This is an endangered species here in Ontario and in Canada, and so is protected under the Endangered Species Act provincially. And one of the rivers where the species was found historically is the Credit River that runs through the GTA. It was quite common there in the early 1900s, but it seems to have disappeared from there since. The reasons why are not completely known, but it probably has something to do with stream quality and stream degradation. Many of these riverine dragonflies rely on fairly good water quality, but they also rely on natural erosional processes, because the larval stage for many of these riverine dragonflies live in the sediments like these ones here that are found in the deposition zones of naturally meandering streams and rivers. So in some instances where rivers are altered, such as this one here, and the natural erosional processes no longer function, all of the sediments are washed downstream and there's no sediments left behind for the larva to live in. So this is an example of one kind of alteration that may have had an impact on certain species that have declined. Another one of our endangered species here in Ontario and Canada is the Heinz Emerald. This is a globally rare dragonfly, the first dragonfly in the US to be listed as federally endangered. And it's only known from one small area here in Canada, the Menacing Wetlands in Simcoe County, just sort of west of Barrie and Orillia. Fascinating thing about this particular species is it's found in fen habitats. And often those fen habitats, the water table goes below the surface in the middle of the summer. And the larva of this species enables to survive those drought periods by living in the burrows of burrowing crayfish. So down below the water table, they seek refuge by living in these crayfish burrows. So the crayfish themselves are part of the critical habitat for this particular species. Where there aren't burrowing crayfish, the species tends not to be able to survive. But not all of our species are rare. Many of our species are common and widespread. Here in Ontario, we have over 170 different species of dragonflies and damselflies. Like I said, many of these are quite common and widespread. So that largely leaves me towards the end here of the presentation. We've talked quite a lot about the fascinating life history of these insects, spending a lot of time on how they breed and create new offspring. We've talked about how you yourself can maybe learn a little more about them and contribute any observations you might discover yourself to our collective and ever-growing knowledge of their distribution, biology, and ecology. We touched at the end on some of their conservation and their habitats. So at this point, I would like to thank very much everyone for joining. And I'd like to thank the Friends of the Napanee and the Salmon River for having me join you this evening. And at this point, if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. And down the bottom of the screen there, you can see my email address. So if you have any questions that you'd like to direct to me through email, that's also a possibility.
Oh, that's excellent, Colin. I'm Stephen Moore. My main credential is that I'm Susan Moore's husband, and I'm going to sort of guide us along through some of the questions, if that's all right.
Great.
Okay. I know one time Kurt Hennigy was out at our house and we were looking at dragonflies and damselflies, and I was running along some rocks in the river and slipped and turned into a mud ball. Has anything like that ever happened to you?
Oh yeah, quite a few times. I think I have many similar stories that I could relay.
There are a number of great questions from people who have been tuning in, so I'll just go through the ones that you haven't really answered yet. Are adult dragonflies and damselflies territorial?
That is a really good question, and it's not an easy question to answer, actually. So yes, they tend to be territorial in a sense. So, and this depends on species as well. So that Ebony Jewelwing, that beautiful one I showed at the beginning of the presentation with the jet black wings, the damselfly, there's been quite a lot of research done on the jewel wings, and they tend to be highly territorial. And so they actually seem to stake out a spot on the stream where they think would be really great spot for a female to lay her eggs. And they actually display to the female a complicated sort of display that most other dragonflies and damselflies don't do, to show her the spot. And then if she wants to mate with that male, then she will, and the rest of the life history continues. Most other dragonflies and damselflies don't have that complex of a territorial and or display, but the males will chase off or appear to chase off other males. But their territory may be a little more fluid. So they might not fix in on one particular area per se, but they may move around a little more. And the territory sort of moves with them, but they'll, potentially be aggressive towards other males. Although there's another line of thought that suggests that perhaps they're not being territorial or aggressive to other males, but perhaps they're actually flying after them, thinking they could be potential mates. But a male is not going, they're going to start doing this. So it looks like they're fighting, but they may actually be just trying to grab each other as a potential mate rather than being territorial and fighting. So, but the verdict is out on what exactly is going on there. So yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's not 100% conclusive.
I see in most of your photos that you're handling dragonflies, holding them by the wings above the main body. Is that the best way to handle so that there's no injury either to you or the dragonfly or damselfly?
Yeah, absolutely. So unlike butterflies, where if you grab onto their wings, anyone who's done that before, you get the scales onto your fingers, and that can have a certain amount of can cause a certain amount of damage to the butterfly. Dragonfly wings don't have those scales, so you're not going to be at risk of taking off the scales off of their wings. And the wings themselves are quite strong, quite robust, except for very, ones that have just recently emerged. Their wings are actually quite fragile, so it's good not to handle those ones. But once their wings are fully formed, when you catch them in the net, the safest way for the dragonfly to handle them is to take your fingers and basically along the sides of the body, and then fold them up over their back, pinch them all together like you saw in my photographs, and that basically immobilizes them so that they can't flutter around. Because if you grab onto just one or two wings, their muscles are so strong they're going to flip around and rip, and they literally rip their wing off. But by holding them that way with their wings all over their back, you immobilize them. You're not going to damage their wings, and it allows you to look at them more closely. And then when you're ready to let them go, you can let them go, and they'll fly away without doing any damage to them. So yeah, that is the best way to handle them.
That's great. Is a photo required for an entry into iNaturalist?
No, photos are not required. They're very much encouraged. And the way iNaturalist works is that there's a community vetting process. So when you submit a record, you can either say what you think it is to the species level, or you could just say, this is some sort of dragonfly. I have no idea what it is. And then someone from the community will come along and say, oh, well, that's an Ebony Jewelwing. And then someone else will come along and say, yes, it is an Ebony Jewelwing. And once two people agree, it becomes what's called research grade. And at that point, the records go into a larger database called GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Framework. So, but without submitting a photograph, there's no ability for anyone to confirm your record. So that's why they encourage the photographs, but you can submit records without photographs, but they will always be what's called casual grade. They won't be, they can't be turned into research grade records that way. It doesn't mean they're incorrect. It's just the way that iNaturalist works.
Sure. Yep. Have you ever discovered a new species and been able to name it?
No, not a new species to science, but I've been very fortunate enough to discover several new species for Ontario and Canada. So those have been very exciting moments in my life. One of which was in my very early years of looking at dragonflies and damselflies in the early to mid 90s. My friend Peter Burke and I were looking for dragonflies and damselflies in this area, around the Peterborough area, and we found one. And at that time there were no field guides, of course, so we had to collect them, kill them, bring them back, and then work them through these scientific keys in some of the older reference materials. And we couldn't key this particular individual out. It just wasn't coming out to anything. And so we got in touch with Paul Pratt, who's a very well-known naturalist down in the Windsor area, who we knew had been looking at dragonflies longer than we had. We described what we'd seen to him, and he said, "Oh wow, that sounds very much like the common sand dragon." And so sure enough, we looked a little more into it, and here it was, this species that had never been recorded in Canada before. And so it was a very exciting moment for us, especially as young sort of budding naturalists.
Oh, I'll bet. Yeah. Actually, Sharon Fellows wants to know, does anyone know where I can find the Williamson's Emerald? What sort of habitat would the Williamson's Emerald inhabit?
Yeah, so Williamson's Emerald. So most of the emeralds, not all the emeralds, but most of them tend to be found in sort of more boggy and fenny types of habitats. And so Williamson's Emerald is often found along streams that run through somewhat sort of fen and bog type habitats. So that's the kind of place you would look if you wanted to see a Williamson's Emerald. Although the adults can wander some distance, and you can sometimes find them well away from habitats like that. But I would be honing in on that kind of habitat to find a Williamson's Emerald.
Okay. Do dragonflies typically capture their prey on the fly, or do they attack them when their prey is stationary? And a supplementary question is, can dragonflies fly backward?
Yeah, great question. So with respect to flying backward, yeah, they can fly backward to a certain extent. They can't completely like fly backward, but they can hover around and they can sort of move back in short little blips like that. As for their hunting their prey, some are completely aerial, so they hover and fly and look for their prey, and then when something flies out, then they'll intercept it. And then others are more stationary, where they'll sit on a perch and they'll watch for prey, and then if something comes by, then they'll dart out and grab it. They will sometimes pick prey off of perches, but they're getting them in the air, whether they're flying actively or sitting and watching and then darting out to grab them like a flycatcher might.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that the lifespan of an adult dragonfly or damselfly might be weeks. Do any of them migrate?
Yeah, another excellent question. And most do not migrate, but some do. And sort of the monarch of the dragonfly world is a species called the common green darner. So it's one of our large darners. They're lime green on the thorax, and then the abdomen in the males is blue and sort of pinkish in the female. And so they, the adults in the summer that we see here in the summer, they'll be laying, in the spring and the summer, they'll be laying eggs. And they actually, unlike most dragonflies that are big like that, they have very rapid larval development. And so their offspring emerge only a few weeks later into the adult stage. And primarily in the month of September, those adults fly south. And they fly south to the southern United States, Mexico, and even to the northern parts of Central America. But unlike monarchs, where they then overwinter and at least start to make those same individuals start to make the voyage back northward, in the common green darners, they breed down in the southern parts, and then it's their offspring that then return the following spring. So no individual makes the trip both ways. Each generation flies just in one direction. And that's one of our migratory species. There's a few others, but that's the one that's sort of the monarch of the dragonfly world.
Mm-hmm. Now, it seems a bit obvious that if you have water on your property, you'll attract dragonflies. Are there any other ways to make your property more attractive? And is there such a thing as a dragonfly feeder?
Yeah, no, I mean, so water is obviously important for their complete life history. But, you know, if you've got a yard with lots of vegetation and lots of other insects, visiting flowers, for example, and that kind of thing, then, you know, you're going to have a prey base for dragonflies that might then forage in your yard at the very least.
Right.
But yeah, there's no kind of feeder type of thing. Although I will say, some of you may have experienced this. Those of you in areas where black flies can be quite prolific in May and June, you yourself might become a feeder, not only for the black flies, but as black flies fly around you. I've had this in many cases, been swarmed with black flies, and they're crawling all over my shirt and all over my head. And some dragonflies will come in and actually start picking them off of you. So in a way, you could sort of be the feeder.
Yeah, I know that's a good time for a fist pump, eh? When yes. What is the name of the dragonfly that is on your questions slide again?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I didn't mention that. That is called the calico pennant. And so most dragonflies don't have patterned wings. They have very clear wings. But this is one that has very richly patterned wings. It's quite a small little dragonfly. But yeah, it's called the calico pennant.
Oh, excellent. And what is the evolutionary value of the bright colors?
Oh, well, that's a good question too. It's probably very similar to birds in a sense. You know, it may be it's probably partially mate recognition. It may have something to do with attractiveness for females to males. Hard to say for sure. But yeah, many dragonflies have bright coloration, whether it's greens or yellows or blues or reds. There are very few that are dull. The ones that are dull tend to be the species that are a little more crepuscular. So there are a few species that only forage in the evening, the late evening, and they tend to be quite dull in coloration.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I don't know if you can see the chat box or not, but there are lots of excellent presentation, great presentation. Thank you very much. I learned a lot, and I think that's probably the consensus of everybody on the call. So thank you very much, Colin.